both online and offline. And just to continue to advocate for women and girls in general within your spaces. I mean, that's why we're all here today, right? To learn and to grow and to, you know, be in our activism, both online and offline. I encourage everyone to ask questions and to give comments in the chat, and because we will be having some time at the end of the session for Q&A, but please feel free to drop your questions and thought in the chat box as they come to you. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Siobhan Davids. I'm grateful to introduce our panel for today. The CVs can stretch longer than the webinar itself, so I'm only providing some highlights. So when you type your questions in the chat, you have a better idea of who to direct them to. Malene Marume is a gender and development expert with a master's in development policy from the University of Reading. Within UN Women, Malene has worked at national and global levels, recently managing the Pretoria Samco office. Melina Rousseau, an internationally recognized human rights activist with extensive experience in private and public sector work, including serving in the offices of the Constitutional Court and the Office of the Presidency, and currently directs the Women Lead movement. Dr. Anangwe lectures in the Humanities faculty at the University of Nairobi, specializing in gender disparities and minority group vulnerabilities. One of Dr. Anangwe's most recent publications looked at the rights of marginalized communities and intimate partner violence. Professor Domingo is the current Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Johannesburg, with a Doctor of Juridical Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Domingo was appointed by the President to serve on the South African Law Reform Commission as a commissioner. Now we welcome the panelists, and we're going to open up with a question that I think we can all think about.
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Hope Nabalayo. I'm a journalism student at the University of Nairobi, and I am grateful to be part of this narrative. Of course, every story has an origin, and I believe that we're not here by coincidence. We're all here because we have a common goal and a common initiative to bring gender-based violence to an end. And of course, we're all curious to how we all found ourselves in this space of activism. And we would love to hear from our panelists how they found themselves here. And of course, we encourage all our guests to share their reasons in the comment section, and we will be going through that. Maybe we could start with Dr. Anangwe. You could tell us how you are here with us today and what motivates you to be part of the cause.
Thank you, I hope. Good morning, everyone, and fellow panelists. How I happened to be here is I got a pretty invite and decided to honor the invite. But beyond that, on a serious note, I think what we've been talking about, or what we're talking about in the past 16 days, is an issue of concern because it layers with very many other issues of social inequality, especially in sociology and in society. And so by talking about the most vulnerable, which is a category we're talking about today, the women and the girls, you're more or less moving towards finding solutions to problems, especially the issue of GBV, where we are seeing it is becoming more intense. The incidents may not be increasing, but the intensity is there. And I think as a student of journalism, for example, Hope, you have come across images, which we are seeing now, of persons who are not necessarily traditional. They're living in modern society, but the amount of damage that one is doing to the other is amazing in the sense that it is shocking. So because of that, I find myself in this space, especially because I've got access to students, young persons who are now moving out into their lives and making something of themselves, being able to reach that amount of persons and talk to them about the need to respect each other as human beings. I think that is why I feel that I am in the right place to be speaking to this issue. As well, in my other life, I do work with women in marginalized areas. So I get access to other kinds of stories that are not necessarily of young persons. And those stories also need to be ventilated. So I give those women a chance by listening to them and sitting around a table to see what can be done best, because sometimes it's not so much destroying what already exists, but trying to build on what is there, but towards a positive direction. So creating new trajectories of thought among young persons and persons who already have experienced GBV. I think that is really what is the impetus and the import of my being here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anangwe. We're looking forward to hearing your inputs in the discussion. And maybe now Melina could tell us why she is here today.
Thank you very much to your team. Obviously, I was invited by you guys because not only do you follow me, but I also follow you in your incredible work that you are doing. So my journey into activism started 5 years ago. I had a normal job, you know, I had a full-time employment, and I was not oblivious to the challenges that was happening to women and girls in the world. But I think my position protected me. In fact, it provided me a level of ignorance, you know, not to engage with a particular issue. But gender inequality affects all people in society, even men. I think it impacts them as well to a large extent, but women and girls in particular. And what motivated me ultimately was to empower our women and girls, in particular with regards to human rights. Because I'm a constitutional lawyer by profession, I specialize in human rights law. I had a huge challenge with the fact that our women and our girls did not understand. They had no education, no knowledge, no awareness about their human rights. And that is really how we got into the space, and we started the Women-led movement. But obviously when we started the Women-led movement and we started to work in communities and high schools with young people and in universities, we found about obviously the issue of gender-based violence to be a very big challenge as well. And so today I'm here because I'm angry. I'm frustrated that we are not making progress towards the eradication of gender-based violence. I'm frustrated because we need to beg and plead for our right at the table, when in fact we have equal rights in society, and that those rights should be enforced. I'm angry at the lack of progress in achieving gender equality. I mean, right now it's going to take us 132 years. Last year it was 99 years. Next year it might be 200 years because of political will, not because of laws, but because of lack of political will to implement the framework, the legal framework that protects the rights and interests of women. That is why I'm here, because I want to make a change, irrespective of how big or how small that change might be. I want to add my voice. I don't want to be part or not part of a revolution. Looking back at my life to say that I had an opportunity to speak out to women and girls, but I did not do so. That is why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Melina. We are all here to make that change, and we believe that we will, whether big or small. And now I hand it to Professor Domingo.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to the wonderful young team. I think it's absolutely amazing to see, I want to say particularly university students driving this and putting together such a fantastic panel. So I think we all have networks, and someone within my network knows your work that you do, and that's how I also received the invitation. But it is an honor to be on this panel with the other women that's here. But my journey started when I started teaching at a university, and it comes in multiple forms. I taught family law, and part of that curriculum is domestic violence. And teaching that to students. And often when you go into a class, you don't take into account that you're actually teaching human beings. And so you teach a subject. And I realized that when teaching a particular curriculum to students, it's real people with real stories, and we have to be sensitive to that. I encountered a lot of females at university who came forward, who was within a home where they were subject to gender-based violence. As a leader within a university, a head of school and a dean, when I started, there were 3 rapes of law students. So it is, I want to say, prevalent to me on a daily basis within a university space. So my work has really been to develop policies and have them practically implemented at university levels to be female and women-centric in that. And we do know that males also suffer gender-based violence, but it's to create safe spaces for students to report matters. What we see is a culture of isolation. They're afraid to speak out and they're scared of the consequences that they will be labeled. So what we have is a high dropout rate at the university level. On another, I wear multiple caps. So I'm also the president of the South African Law Deans Association. Last year, there was the brutal killing of Ms. Mitabeni at the University of Fort Hare as Salda. The law deans, what we did is we put out a call to all universities to take action, not just words, not just signing of policies, but to practically do something. And so those are my journeys. I'm also a family law mediator. And if we look at divorce in South Africa, there is a high rate of gender-based violence within our country. So there's multiple levels that I work on, but I'm here today to have a voice and to say to people that we need to work collectively. As someone who teaches law, as someone who's a family law mediator, as someone who monitors the legislation, law in itself is not the tool. It's one of the tools, but it's not the only one. We have to work collectively at a grassroots level, and it needs to filter through the top, because you cannot deal with gender-based violence in isolation. So that's my call. We can have the most wonderful legislation and laws, but it's not perfect, and it cannot be implemented if we don't work together collectively. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Domingo. That is very well said, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you and all the progress you've made in implementing these policies in university levels. And of course, now we will have our final panelist, that is Moline Marume. Welcome.
Morning, everyone. So I will put my video just to introduce myself, and then I will switch it off. I moved to a new place, so I'm currently actually hotspotting from my phone. So I'm afraid I don't want to exhaust my phone before the webinar ends. So just to thank you so much for inviting me. I think as introduced, I'm Moline. Been with UN Women 8 years now, going on 9 years, very soon a decade. And women's rights issues have become, I wasn't always an activist. I was actually a researcher initially, but having joined UN Women, and once you're in the space, because women's rights, gender equality, that's our mandate as UN Women. It's the UN agency that was essentially established to look at women's rights and advance gender equality. So once you're in the space, there's a lot of things I think that we take for granted or we don't think about. We do. Some of it we actually perpetuate, the very same norms and harmful practices that we now look at. We do it very unconsciously. It just happens because of the societal upbringing, because of the way we're brought up. We say statements like boys don't cry, and we don't realize the implications of that. What does that mean for boys, in particularly in this day and age? We're getting quite a lot of young men and a lot of suicides. Men are not opening up. I think there's currently an advert on TV where they're trying to get, to create platforms for men to speak. Women can be in groups, they can cry, they can speak, but men cannot do the same. So when we are looking in particular at GBV in this country or in this part of the world, in Southern Africa, it boggles the mind. I mean, I've been in South Africa for a year now. In the statistics, just sometimes when you think it can't get any worse, it actually gets worse. And you wonder what exactly is going on in the minds of the man, of the perpetrator, of whoever is perpetrating. How do you rape and mutilate a 9-month-old, a 3-year-old? It's a sickness, it's a mental illness. What is it exactly? So I think one of the things we've been trying to explore, even as UN Women in South Africa, we are definitely working with the different civil society organizations, advancing the National Strategic Plan for GBV. It lists the good thing with South Africa, I think it is the highest political will that the president himself is endorsing this. So at the very highest political level, it does have that support. But obviously, whether that then trickles down to the different levels of government and everybody else is another question. But at least the political will is there. But apart from that, the laws, South Africa, I think as people say, South Africa is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. It endorses the rights of women, guarantees the rights of women, but how that is translated into practice is something else. So this is when now we have now been trying to reflect and look at what are the laws that we have, the different policies, the strategies are there, but still the awareness raising, we've done that. Most of the women, I think, sometimes know their rights. They know how to get a protection order. I think South Africa is one of those countries, the paradox where a woman actually gets a protection order and still gets killed with her protection order in her house. So then you start asking, is that the way that we need to be doing? What does that piece of paper protect a woman? Because it clearly isn't. They're still getting killed even with the protection order. So it begs the question now to now start looking and reflecting, going deeper. What exactly is it that's driving? Is it the legacy of apartheid? How do we heal South Africa? How do we move so that we change the norms, encourage respect for women, that men or perpetrators don't look at a woman as an object. If I buy this one, if I buy her a drink, she's mine. I get to demand and do whatever I want. So there's a lot of conversations, I think, that need to happen. A lot of things, the laws, the structures, the mechanisms sometimes are in place. I think we saw, I was in Zimbabwe before I joined South Africa, and I remember the early days of the lockdown. One of our civil society members called me in distress because a relative of hers had just been beaten up by the husband, and she had gone to the police. Very affluent market where you would expect, affluent area where you would expect the police to actually react. So they went to report, and the policeman at the other side of the desk told her to go and bring her husband to the police station so they could talk. And this is a person who has just beaten her up. And this is in a very affluent area. So I started questioning, if this can happen in a very affluent area in Harare, what more in a rural area or in a very remote area, what rights do women have? If a woman who supposedly knows her rights, knows she has to go and report, goes and report, and she still gets that kind of reception. So then it's the institutions, the duty bearers behind the desks, everybody, the structures, the mechanisms are there, but the people that are implementing those mechanisms, then therein lies the gap and the challenge, and what do we do with that, and how do we move past that? So for me, 16 days, I mean, we should essentially be 365 days. It's constantly looking at what are the gaps, what do we need to do more? We have done a lot, but we are missing something. What else is it that we are missing that can tip the balance, that we need to focus on and tip the balance and really start changing the tide so that South Africa doesn't become known as the rape capital of the world? It's not a title to be proud of at all, but it is there all the time. And how do we change that? How do we move that? Moving from even Southern Africa being the center of child marriage, lots of child marriage, HIV, the epicenter of HIV infection is Southern Africa. And these are young women, 18 to 24. So how do we change that tide? I think for me, this is what gender-based violence, 16 days is all about. And how do we get communities to then stand up when some of these things happen? If they happen in the family, families keep quiet and they, you can't do this, you embarrass Malume, you embarrass the uncle, so we keep quiet. But how do you get communities to stand up and say, enough is enough? This doesn't happen. If this happens, we need to take appropriate action, whether it's the father, the uncle, the pastor, or whoever it is that's perpetrating. We need to stand up as communities and say no. So I think to avoid lecturing, I think that's it. I think this is one of the reasons why I joined. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Moline. And this is the perfect place to have that conversation. And we're all very excited for the discussion we're about to have, clearly our panel is fit for the task. Of course, I still encourage our audience to share their reasons for being in the activism space. We would love to hear from you. And just reintroducing our theme, which is the post-pandemic tears in the society, we would love to kick off with our theme, which is COVID-19. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for those wonderful introductions. A great way to start and get us excited for what's to come. And when we were thinking about where to start with this conversation, I think we realized that it has to be COVID, because the pandemic has affected us all and in a very drastic way. And interestingly enough, the UN Women coined the term the shadow pandemic to describe gender-based violence. And we thought that was very appropriate. In a lot of our spaces, COVID-19 as a pandemic is resolving, and now we're seeing the aftermath that it has had on gender-based violence rates, not only from a statistical point of view, but also looking at how individuals have been affected emotionally, psychologically, physically. And so to open, I'll direct our first question to Dr. Kathleen. Considering the previous COVID-19 stay-at-home conditions, accompanied with the interference of social activities, which has caused the rise in GBV cases, not only in Kenya, but worldwide, how are we helping survivors adjust to the society in terms of empowerment and dignity restoration?
Thanks a lot, Barbara, for that question. And just as an entry, I think I'd want to share a piece of intrigue. I think the most surprising thing to social scientists when COVID happened, and COVID was now related to high incidences of GBV, it sort of flipped everything on its head. You would think that if people are put in a space together with this threat of a pandemic, they'll unite. But instead, we're seeing the opposite. People were now, the conflict was even greater with repercussions you don't even want to talk about. So putting people in proximity created this volatile scenario, and that's basically what we're talking about. So when we look at issues of empowerment, I think what we've been able to achieve post-pandemic, looking at the shadow pandemic, which is an apt description of what it is. In terms of empowerment, it takes time. I think we also have to be aware of the fact that these things just don't happen in one sitting. Just as Professor has said, when it comes to students, it may ruin their semester. It means they have to defer their studies. And just as Maureen has said, you're looking at a cultural context. And historical issues like apartheid. For us, it's colonialism. It still does hang on. And basic arrangements, social arrangements in the social structure, for example, rural women and girls versus urban women and girls. So you're looking at different shades and layers of GBV in different spaces. So we want to also be aware of that. And the fact that there are public spaces and private spaces. So there are women who will experience it in private space, but in public space, they seem okay. Others in both spaces, because you've got contested notions of what your context is. And then others just in the public space. You walk out and you've got this hostile world, whether at work or at school, or indeed wherever you're living outside your family network. So all those are contexts that we can begin to build our ideas of empowerment and dignity restoration post the pandemic. We must be aware that they haven't really changed much. So in terms of empowerment, I tend to think that looking at it in a sustainable way and giving it some duration, I would want to imagine that the first step that has been put in place is discussing it, talking about it, that we've got this space to actually discuss it. It does give the victims a sense of significance. I don't want to use the word important, significance. People are talking about it. That means it means something, because we know when you have studied GBV and the trajectory of GBV, people who have experienced this tend to think they blame themselves. But now when we talk about it, when young persons talk about it, everybody begins to own it. And so the obligation to protect becomes our business. to discuss. So through public fora, we've been able to provide a little bit of empowerment to victims. They may not see it immediately. It may be something that takes a while to percolate. Media engagement has worked towards empowerment. The media talk about it. I think they have not been they've not been shy, despite the magnitude. I just pick a case in point in Kenya, where a couple that were dating, they were not yet a couple, they were just dating, and because the lady refuses the gentleman's sexual advances, he throws her off the building. I think she was on 6th floor, and she lands on the ground. They just had the case the other day, and the young man, he's really young, has 15 years. And we ask ourselves, in terms of law, is that enough? She's now disabled for life. And just like Hope had said, we're also looking at disability, all these other layers that talk to exacerbating the incidents and the outcomes of GBV. Who started it? We're asking those questions, and I just put that in the chat, that we are asking questions and reflecting. So in as much as Maureen is saying, yes, it is 365 days, that's how it's supposed to feel. 16 days makes us stop, think, reflect, look, and begin acting again, because you must always synergize yourselves. So media engagement has done well, and I think has expanded space even for victims to talk without putting their face out there. So the Twitter, for example, where you can tweet your thoughts, you can actually bring people into your space, into your mind, and let them experience what you experience on a daily basis. Skits that young people are preparing are also helping older persons, because we realize there is also GBV in aging couples. We may not know that. We always think it's young people and persons who are still productive. I'm not saying that aging persons are not productive, they should hear me. But in that space, then you find sometimes it reverses, where the female now is female on male, gender-based violence, or male on female still, depending on the female's condition. So those are scenarios we need to be looking at, not just pockets of what we see in the media, but what could be there. So talking about it, media discussion stories, listening to victim stories that are live, through recordings, through monographs, and in studentship spaces. Because what enriches conversation is not so much making it academic, but giving it an academic, breathing academia into it, because then it sits well. It is not just people's opinions, but rather well-researched, well-articulated, and well-documented. I think that thread has been missing in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're documenting our cases so we can look back and say, this is what was happening at this time, so what has changed, and mitigating that change, right? So as social change is happening, a lot of other things are changing as well. Society is dynamic. So the horrors also take on a new dynamic trend that can sometimes be difficult to contain if you just think about empowering. However, and just to end that point on empowerment, what have we done? We've created safe spaces as well, where persons who are experiencing this don't necessarily have to endanger themselves by getting a court order and living with it in the same house with the person. Sometimes, the court seems to be blind to your reality. So your children and yourself are still in the same space, even though the case is in court. I don't know how that would even work, but giving women, and I can see NGOs and CBOs coming up with different locations where they can create shelter for a while. A while can be 2-3 years, and helping women especially find their footing. Hashtags, using phone lines, hotlines. I know our police service is always ridiculed because they never seem prepared enough to deal with GBV. Maybe it's a kind of fear that they have. But now a lot of them are trained. We have in Kenya, for example, in every police station, there is an officer who is prepared to deal with those issues. And so they're the ones that take up the initial reporting, because the way it's reported and received really dictates how you shall deal with it. So empowerment at different levels. I'm looking at the economic scenario where women are creating business hubs. So there's empowerment in that sense, where victims can get assistance as special cases. So making those women who have experienced GBV a special category, that receive special attention. I think that is what I have seen working with empowerment. As well, the political will, I think we can give a case in point of Kenya, where we've got political office that is geared towards women's issues specifically. It may not work efficiently, but that the intent behind it has been noble. So perhaps in our space now, going forward, we could think of making those spaces responsible and speaking to what it is they have achieved in terms of directly enhancing the victims' lives post GBV. So that is how I'd want to see the empowerment happening. I also think of it as generational. I think younger generations now we are equipping them. I want to speak as we, because the mandate is now in our hands. We are tasked with empowering those after us to be able to speak to each other, to speak about each other, to speak together. So more community-based mobilization, more individual-based, within institutions, for example, the family, in whichever form. So the family does not have to be a cultural form. It can be new emerging forms like the blended family, for instance. So in those spaces, encouraging conversation without vilification, I think, is one of the ways of empowering those that went through GBV post-COVID. I'm now just situating the conversation. And then in terms of dignity restoration, sometimes when you lose a bit of yourself, I don't know that it can be restored at all. But we have to go towards a journey of healing nationally, at the macro level, meso level, and micro level. So nationally, and then specifically at the individual level. So how do people who have lost a part of themselves, be it physically, if your hands, you remember the case in Kenya of a woman's hand being chopped off, literally. And so she now has no hands. How do you make her accept herself? And I remember when she was interviewed after her prosthetics, she put on a brave face and said, I'm doing well, I'm happy that I've got this. But after a few minutes, she broke down crying and said, I'm still not myself. So getting real about even whatever we give, not as Band-Aid solutions, but as lasting solutions, getting real and going back to it, I think would really leverage the dignity restoration. Not easy, but it can be done. Making sure victims accept and also provide some of the remedies. We tend to think that we can just legislate and write and then pontificate, but we also want the victims to tell us, what is it that we can help you with? So you're meeting the individual at their point. And I would want to say that NGOs, CBOs, and para-church organizations have been good with dignity restoration. When you follow through with them, you realize that there are programs emerging that will work to restore dignity. And just to speak to Professor Domingo's point of dealing with students, I think many institutions of higher learning were able to see this. In most of them who went online could see the students' performance was not the same as when they're in class, because they're in the situation either as children of violent couples or as, sometimes students are already married, so as a part of the violent couple itself, and you could see the student is not participating well. We even had cases where videos are turned off so that food can be prepared, not because people will die if you waited for another 1 hour, but because of the power struggles that emerged within that closed set of individuals. So dignity restoration will take time. It's very psychological. So it needs a lot of hearing and a lot of talking. And in Africa, we have many avenues. So we don't just have the formal, there's also the informal. And that is something I think we need to activate, those informal avenues of information giving and managing society, as it were, especially post-COVID. Because, if we know pandemics very well, it may come back in another form. So we need to be well prepared. And I think this is the right forum to be doing that. Those are my thoughts on those two areas.
Thank you, Dr. Nangwe. That was a very, very detailed response. And I'd like to pick on two significant things you've mentioned in your answers. After citing some cases, especially here in Kenya, your question was, is that enough in terms of the law in terms of how these cases are being reacted to. And of course, you brought out the whole accountability aspect in the sense that these policymakers need to be more responsible in going back to the cases and reacting to how were these handled and how are we moving forward. And I think that is a great point to bring in Professor Domingo to tell us more on what type of policies and implementations have been made that could perhaps give women more hope on moving forward, especially during the COVID-19 period.
Thank you. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic and particularly the lockdown has exacerbated, I want to say, the pre-existing problems: poverty, inequality, crime, unemployment, and then I want to say the systemic failure of the criminal justice system. And we saw this because women could not leave their homes. So they were in places where crime was being committed. And we saw the deaths of many families within the first 2 weeks of lockdown. Many women died during that period. So in South Africa, there has been a call for change in legislation. And I'm happy to say that the president did heed that call by introducing 3 bills, which were signed off in early part of this year, which was January 2022. Now, I will just briefly touch on these bills, but what I want to say is, while they may address gaps in legislation to assist women, as I said earlier, this legislation just becomes paper, lip service. We've done it, great, we've signed these things into law. They have to be implemented. And that's the problem that we're going to face. And so there was a change to the Domestic Violence Act. So we have the Domestic Violence Amendment Act, and then there was changes to the Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act now. And so some of the things that was introduced was a new offence of sexual intimidation. There was the expansion of the National Register for Sex Offenders. And so before, you only had the names of sex offenders against children. That is now expanded, and that's a good thing, right? So if you are entering into a marriage or you know of someone or you suspect somebody, or employers can now go onto this register to see if someone is listed or named on there. It also expands the list of people who are to be protected to include women, and I want to say this specifically, under the age of 25 who are studying or living in a student residence. So often also what happens is gender-based violence takes place in a student residence, and the young female or the male may say, I don't have a relationship with this person. I'm not in an intimate relationship with the person. We just live in a commune, or we live in the res together. If you are living in that particular manner and there is a communal residential area and there is instances of harassment or intimidation, there is a domestic violence relationship there. So I do want to point that out. It doesn't mean that you have to be physically intimate with that person. There's also protection for people under the who's elderly. So gender-based violence also takes place in, I want to say, old age homes, which is often neglected, right? And there's huge abuse of our elderly within those homes as well. Then the register also allows for sex offenders' particulars to remain on the register. So normally the length of the original sentence will depend on how long the name will be there. And so it's really dependent on there. And so that has been expanded. So the names could be on that register for a much longer time. There's also things like you can have now intermediaries when someone goes to court, so the woman doesn't actually have to retell a story, but there could be a third party that could help. Now, one of the biggest changes has been in our Domestic Violence Act. It now includes a variety of definitions. So domestic abuse includes controlling behavior and coercive behavior. The definition of domestic violence includes spiritual abuse. And I want to say spiritual abuse is very important in the context of South Africa, particularly where we have a multicultural society. Belief and cultural beliefs is a huge thing, and there could be an abuse of that as well. There's elder abuse, there's controlling behavior, and a significant change has been children being subjected to abuse, children actually seeing the abuse. And so often what happens is when a woman comes for that order, she says, well, you know what, he's a good father, but he abuses me. But does your kid see it? Yes, they do. And so the child is subjected to that abuse as well, and the child needs protection. A significant thing about this, the Domestic Violence Amendment Act, is that it removes gender binary terms. And it relies on gender neutral terminology. And that's a huge thing for South Africa to do, because it ensures inclusivity and equal protection for all purposes, persons. So it's across the board. And so we're not having these binaries of it's a male, female thing. It is inclusive. It expands the scope of the act to apply to all forms of harm, including electronic communications. So something that has arisen out of COVID-19, there was an increase on being online. And being online, we were using Teams, there was TikTok, there was social media, there was Facebook, there's all sorts of things. And abuse takes place on those platforms, and that's often neglected. You can have controlling behavior where someone is monitoring you on your tweets, on what you're sending on Facebook. And so we now have included in this Domestic Violence Act, electronic communication. There's also a section which says the electronic communication service providers may be called upon to provide evidence. So you can call up your WhatsApp messages to say how abusive someone was in that space as well. Then it also introduces, and I want to say almost imposes obligations on the Department of Health and Social Development and on the police. And this is important because if there's a failure by these departments to do something, we can take them to task because they have a responsibility. And with the responsibility, this is important at a government level, money will follow. Because most of the times we are said, well, you know what, it's a progressive realization of something. But if there is an obligation, money has to be attached there, training has to happen, and there has to be implementation. The court can also issue, and this is something very novel, they can issue a domestic violence safety monitoring notice. So a domestic safety monitoring notice can be accompanied with a protection order. And what that means is the monitoring notice will direct the police to contact the applicant regularly and visit the home. And if the police cannot reach out to this particular woman or man, then they can use reasonable force to gain entry into the home without a warrant. And this is important because they can check out. Whether that will materialize into reality, I'm not sure. I've just recently heard of somebody who obtained a protection order, and she called the police in because the husband had to be removed from the home, and the husband and the police were talking outside, having a conversation. And the police said, oh no, he seems okay. We will leave him there. He just had an off day. Having the protection order. So these are the kinds of things. Or a woman goes over the weekend on a Saturday to the police, and the police says to her, you know what, we don't do protection. We don't do this over the weekend, come on Monday. So while we have this legislation, what I want to say is that implementation is going to be problematic. We have had training of the police, but we need more. But I think this goes into the essence of our unconscious bias of patriarchy within society. So before you can implement this, you have to deal with that biasness of policemen in and of themselves. And so that training is not just training in this is the procedure and the forms that you have to give a woman. It is to go to the essence of what patriarchy is and what equality, gender equality means in society, and dignity and what that means for women. And so we asked, what do we need to do in these 16 days of activism? How do we actually get to the root cause? And the more legislation we implement is not going to solve the problem. It is that unconscious bias. It is addressing that root psychological force that we have within society that allows us to say, no, it's okay. Boys are boys, or men are men. These things happen, just shrug it off. I also want to mention it's the psyche of the woman as well. So up until it happens to you, and it happens to educated women as well, I want to say. So this is not just something where we say, oh no, you know what? I'm educated, it's not going to happen to me. But when it happens to that woman, we often find they don't come forward. And what is the root cause of that? Why are we not reporting? And what are those power relations that's happening? So those are very important things for me. One of the things that COVID also did was that it exposed, I want to say, the intersectionality of gender-based violence, because it was across all sectors. Regardless of gender, race, class, and culture, it was happening within communities. And that was very, very important. Something that we don't do well in South Africa is, while we have this legislation, we don't have shelters for women. We don't have state-sponsored shelters where we put money towards protecting women, because you cannot go and get this protection order and go back to that house. If that man finds out, there's the risk that she will be abused or she will be killed. And that often happens. These women have to rely on family members to find places where they can hide. And so we don't have shelters. We know we have NGOs that have these shelters, but we don't have safe spaces where women can go and be protected and just be anonymous in that space, not having to give off information of where we have, and we don't do that well in South Africa. And so I think we need to start looking at providing those safe spaces with regard to women when they go forward and say, you know what, I actually want to apply for the domestic violence protection order. And so once again, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it's a collective effort. It is also within families themselves. I mean, I come from a community where you often said, you must have patience, you know what, live with the man. We'll chat to him, or we'll pray for him, or we'll do something for him. And so even women going back into their families, it's quite difficult, because those patriarchies exist within those communities, within their own families, and it's very, very difficult for these women to simply leave. And one of the biggest inhibitors of leaving is money. We simply need women to be economically independent so that they can walk out their door and know that they can take their children with them as well. And so that's part of what we need to focus on as well. I can go on forever, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's very interesting, everything you've said. I don't know if I'm biased because I'm a law student as well, but I think it's really important for us to touch on the legal aspect. And it's really frustrating also just to know that we have such a sophisticated legal system in South Africa with all of this legislation in place, and then the problem at the end of the day is just the people and the implementation. And I really agree with the collective effort. And I think that's also, you know, what we're trying to all do here today, is trying to do our little bit, even though it might not be us, but, you know, if each individual does their little bit, I feel like little by little, a little becomes a lot. So thank you so much, Prof. Domingo, for your insights. I actually, the question that I have is also leading on to the legal and policy aspect, which I would like to direct to Melina. And in your introduction, you said, you know, it's not about the laws, it's about the lack of political will, which has been echoed throughout all the speakers. But how can the law be used to promote feminism in third world countries, South Africa or Africa in general, not just for those who are implementing it, but also on a level for us, normal citizens, to mitigate the occurrence of GBV and to just promote feminism in general and gender equity, not just equality.
Thank you very much for that brilliant, very complex question. And I also like the fact that you're using the word sophisticated legal framework. I was one of them. In fact, I was one of them until last year, until I found out that South Africa actually does not have a sophisticated legal framework. We actually don't have that of a progressive constitution. And I think that is the issues that I want to address, because you see, the issue always is, and I mean, Prof mentioned that as well, and I agree with her. We talk about, we have this legal framework and the challenge is the implementation. But I think what the issue is that we don't talk about what those challenges are with regards to the implementation of the law. And I think hopefully my response today will sort of shed light on that particular thing. Now, yes, the non-pessimistic side of me will say that the law is a tool, or can be, or may be a tool that can promote gender equality and that can reduce the incidence of gender-based violence. But the rule of law, and I mean, I'm sitting here with experts, is really just an aspect, and I think Professor Domingo mentioned this, is only the rule of law is only an aspect of the entire process, the entire justice process. That is only one component. So a strong legal framework, in my view, will never be adequate enough to address gender inequality or to address gender-based violence. In fact, the law in itself can be used both as a tool to promote and as a tool to oppress and perpetuate gender inequality. And here I'm talking about where there's a gap in the law, where the law needs to be amended. In fact, when no law exists that has to deal with that specific inequality, and South Africa, unfortunately, is still there. So yes, we can say that we are progressive and we are sophisticated, but I'm telling you now, if the president who has all this will come out and say, let's review all the laws. Let's review all the laws that's causing this lack of access to education, issues with healthcare, issues with the economy, issues with politics. If the president was really had that political will, let's say, let's review all that laws, all those policies. And then we start addressing gender equality from that perspective. Now, let's start with the Constitution, because everyone wants to start with the Constitution. We have South Africa, we have a Constitution, and in that Constitution, we enshrine equal rights to all people. Beautiful. Then we have those delinquent countries that doesn't even have equality rights enshrined in their Constitution. And that obviously poses a huge risk for the advancement of gender equality within that country. But the Constitution, again, is not the only legal instrument to advance gender equality. In fact, what we found is that there's no clear pathway between constitution making and legislative and policy change. Basically saying that the Constitution and what is contained in the Constitution does not translate or does not give effect, is not given effect through policies and legislation. And that is where we are. But to go back to your question, how can the law promote gender equality? The law promotes equality by giving you a legal right, by giving you rights. And when the law, through the Constitution and through other legislation, gives you a right, it automatically gives you legal recognition. It gives you legal protection. And like Prof. Domingo mentioned, there's a legal obligation that arises from the right. So well done. That is what the law does. It gives you a right and then gives you recognition and protection, and there's an obligation to guarantee human rights and fundamental freedoms. And of course, it's important for a society like South Africa, where women are often exploited, abused, violated, oppressed, marginalized, treated with injustice, etc. That is perfect for a society like this.
But now I suppose, and with all of these, sorry to interrupt, with all of these, like you said, we have the card, we have all the rights, but then if no one is implementing them, then it means nothing.
Absolutely. And that's where it comes in. So now I'm going to give you a scenario, and I want very briefly, I want you to picture this. There's this, actually, while Prof. Kathleen was talking there, I was sketching this. How does justice look for a woman like this? And Prof. spoke about the intersectionality. This woman is rural. She lives in a rural community. Sorry, she's Black, she's poor, she's uneducated, and she's disabled, and she's a woman. How does justice look for someone like that? Now, we're going to tell this lady, yes, because you are a citizen of South Africa, you have a right in the Constitution. Well done. She has a right. But how is she going to access that right? Because you can't talk about rights without talking about access to justice, number one, which poses challenges. And you can't talk about having a right without talking about how are we going to enforce, or is there effective enforcement mechanisms in place to realize or to claim or to enforce that particular right. Now, some of the challenges obviously that we have with access to justice, and there's a long list of it. I mean, some of our colleagues mentioned it. But the biggest issue that I have with women accessing justice is the following. Their limited awareness, their skills, their resources, their support, and their power. That they lack. I mean, I mentioned that in the affirmative. So awareness and skill. Women may have less access to information about their rights and entitlements as they seek their remedies. The resources, financial costs of going to court or seeking legal representation to enforce your right. That has normally been one of the main reasons cited by women for not going to court. They don't have the money. They don't have the money to go to court. They don't have the money to appoint lawyers. So how does justice look when you have a right and you can't even enforce that right through the courts? Mobility and geography. Again, another issue no one wants to talk about. People living far from the courts, they have to travel 2 taxis, 1 bus, a train, and an airplane to get to court. They simply do not have the capacity or the resources to do that. And no one is looking at, no one is talking about those things, you know, and that's also an issue. Then I want to talk about the support element. Now, even though women are aware, someone might be aware of their legal rights, which I doubt, because I deal with a lot of women in communities who have absolutely no idea about the human rights, about any other rights that exist within other pieces of legislation without us telling that. And that in itself is the biggest issue. If I have the money today, I would start community legal advice offices. I will provide pro bono legal services to all those poor, disempowered Black women that will never be able to afford legal advice. So how do we empower people without information, without education? We do it through that. So, I mean, barriers upon barriers upon barriers. Then we have to look at the justice structures in itself. Now we have a situation with gender bias and gender insensitive justice actors. And Prof. Domingo spoke about that. From the police to the prosecutor to even the lawyer to the judge. All of them. They are not viewing this thing through a justice or, sorry, a feminist lens or a gender lens as people talk about. They also have limited capacity, and even though they might have the skills, they don't necessarily have the power or the capacity to address gender inequalities. So anyways, that's with regards to access to justice, and really, that is me just touching very on like the pinnacle of some of the key issues. Now we look at the enforcement aspect. What are the challenges with the enforcement of the law? And what is enforcement? Enforcement means that you have a right, and now you act to compel for the compliance of that particular right or law. And without effective enforcement mechanism, the law will generally have no impact. So you have a right, but you don't have access to justice and you can't enforce the law. Meaningless, okay? So what are some of the challenges that prohibits people, the barriers, especially women, from accessing that? The first thing is the lack of clear responsibility and accountability. You see, there's often a lack of clarity on responsibilities for the enforcement of gender equality. So when there's responsibility, obviously, and those responsibilities are clearly defined, then accountability will follow. But at this point in time, no one cares. You know, it's part of our job, but we don't know whose responsibility it is. And if something goes wrong, no one takes accountability. Again, that is a problem within the system in itself. Another issue is gender budgets and funds. I don't know how these people think that gender equality or gender-based violence will be addressed without funding. I mean, I'm an NGO, yes, I always complain about funding. But even in the universities, they expect miracles, but they don't want to give the budget to actually do the work that you're required to do. And that, again, that's what I say, this government, they have no political will, and I will stick to that because I come from government, I come from the highest office in the country, so I have a right to say that. Political will does not mean that you have signed a law and now you are you know, this example of political will. Political will is giving the resources, giving the capacity, both human and whatever capacity, to be able to implement those laws. It is about training people to be competent to deliver on their work. That is political will. Political will for me is saying it's similar to what they did with during COVID as well, where they declared a state of emergency or something like state of disaster. And they declared it very quickly, you know, and then all the money was made available, the laws was being made, you know, plans and programs were put in place. I want that same energy during the year and for all the time that we are here. But that is not, and that is how you test political will. You test it by your ability to make things happen like this, because you regard it as important. And that is what some, and then obviously the lastly, the unequal representation. Sorry. So I'll end off there as well. Women need to see themselves in the justice system. My goodness. You know, often you see men as the clerks. Then you go in court, you see a magistrate who's a man. Then you see this, you feel intimidated. We want to see representation of women within the court system. And I think that is also going to help with the enforcement, because women see things differently. Men, you know, we are giving these people too much power. Really, we are too much for far too long. It's time that the tables turn here, you know. And I think that we are quite diplomatic in our I don't know, in our what's the word? In our request to them for equality. We don't have to request or ask them anything. Okay, it's time that we really start mobilizing each other and start pushing for change.
I agree. And this, honestly, like, thank you so much for your brilliant answer. It's really like firing me up as an aspiring lawyer. I'm like, yes, I want to be there and, you know, like mobilize and on like everything that you said about basically women. And we know that certain women from certain backgrounds face even more of a challenge. And it's just like barrier after barrier, fighting an uphill like climb. And then you get to the top and it's these men, and then you still have to fight even further. And it's just, it's such a complex, difficult situation. And there's so many things that need to be touched. And we just really need that political will. But thank you so much for your answer. And I think now we could move on to Ms. Moline Marume. So we've seen now how complex the quest for equal opportunity is in South Africa, but the global South in general. For the past decade, I mean, even longer. But in your opinion, what success has the UN had in addressing these gender-based violence problems through their policies? And what is actually standing in the way of progress, besides what we've touched on already, you know, the lack of collective efforts and lack of political will, but now specifically from the UN perspective?
Thanks a lot. I think, wow, after hearing the last speaker, there's a lot. I mean, again, this is the time for those reflections when you really go back and you start facing and start looking at what are the realities that we face, what are the things, the barriers that women face. And then in terms, and we do, UN Women, and I think a lot of civil society organizations and even the academia and the presenters that are here, we understand the complexity of equal opportunities. And particularly for us in the South, there's a lot, there are cultural issues that impact on people. They are traditional norms, you know, in some countries when you try and introduce anything or try even to strengthen girls to speak up, you know, there's an issue around girls having self-esteem, standing up for themselves, having that urgency. Even when you try to do that, sometimes there's a backlash. Like globally right now, we're facing a huge backlash on rights. You often hear statements like, oh, these feminists, so feminist has become a dirty word. The moment anybody declares them a feminist, they're open to attack. Because there's this assumption that by empowering or getting girls to take back their power, to stand up for themselves, they're taking the power away from somebody else. So it's a power issue, there's a power dynamic. And I think one of the big things that we need to navigate and understand and find a way to get around is to persuade or to have these conversations that giving power to a woman or letting her speak for herself does not take power away from men. The two of you can be powerful in your own right, with her speaking up for herself, with her standing up and actually saying, no, this is not right, this is not good for me, I will not do that. And that doesn't take anything away from the men. So oftentimes, and with the current world we live in right now, with the current world we currently live in right now, we face issues around Because over the last few years, one of the things that we've done, I think since Beijing 95, there was a lot of push around strengthening women's rights, women's issues. You know, I remember when I was growing up, people would be like, oh, these women from Beijing has taken over, you know, things like that. And I think our parents, that generation, went so far to strengthen and to empower the girl child, the young girls. So they got a lot of, they went to school, went to the good schools, parents made sure that the kids were educated, the girls were educated. And I think somewhere along the way in that, in educating and empowering the girls, parents left the boys along. Not so much that they were leaving the boys, but the assumption was the boys are okay. The boys already have the opportunities. They already have access to these things. So in taking girls forward, as much as we then empowered the girls, we left the boys behind. So now there's an issue of women now, our generation, young women from the 70s, from the 80s, are so empowered, they stand up for their rights. But the men from that generation are still used to a woman must keep quiet, you must submit. So now you have this disconnect. Whenever she stands up and says something, to him it's like a challenge. And then they have to subdue that challenge in some way, and sometimes using force, because this is all they know. They were not taught that a woman standing up for herself is essentially taking anything away from you. So again, these are the realities that now we keep facing in terms of, okay, fine, so what are we facing and what do we have? What are the realities that we face? One of the things I think, again, that came out during COVID, COVID grounded everybody, the lockdowns, you had the men and the women at home. So socially, we know he's supposed to, I think in Africa, or Southern Africa in particular, we grow up being taught, or the social norms dictate that he's a provider, right? He's supposed to provide for his family. He's supposed to look after his family. And then as women, again, one of those subconscious things that we also still grow up taking is, he's supposed to look after me. He's supposed to provide. It's almost like men are measured by how much they can provide and what they can provide. So now you get a situation where during COVID-19, everybody's stuck at home, nobody's working. He's not bringing anything anymore. So now his measure of manhood is questioned because he can't provide. And then at the same time, he's questioning himself because he also feels like, for me to be a man, I have to provide. Because he can't provide, it starts to question a lot of things. She's also looking at it like, why would you be telling me anything? You're not giving me, you're not providing me anything. So, and these are subconscious social norms, things that are ingrained in us, that until it hits you in the face, you don't even notice that it's happening. And COVID brought a lot of these things to the surface, that we started realizing that a lot of these things now were now happening. Men were feeling so disempowered. They were at home. They felt like you don't have power, so then you have to exert it another way. Women were also feeling that men were not worthy. So, and these are things that really come from our cultural context in the spaces that we live in. So one of the things I think in terms of going back to your question and we've been trying then to address, sorry, I think I probably broke off a little bit. One of the things that we are trying to do, South Africa, it's supporting countries at least to come up with these national strategic plans to address as a national. I think one of the speakers earlier on said, this is a whole, it needs to be looking at everybody. Everyone needs to come to the table. You need, for a woman to be truly empowered and for us to address violence, she needs to be empowered enough economically to not be financially dependent on somebody. That requires the economic aspect. She needs a job. In COVID, the big things we saw, lack of social protection for women, because a lot of women are employed in the informal sector. When that shut down, there was no social protection. So you need the economy to come to the table and support with that. And when that violence does happen, she needs to access healthcare services. So you need the health sector to come to the table, to be able to support her. If she at all is violated and she needs to get herself, she needs psychosocial support. You need the social workers. You need, someone needs to put treasury, governments. We can't always rely on donor funding to be able to do this. When the donors pull out, What are we left with? So governments need to commit money in the various government ministries. Each ministry, I think over the past few years, UN Women has been working with a lot of countries on gender responsive budgeting. How do government ministries actually put aside funding to support women's programs, to support gender responsive programs within their various ministries? Whatever they are putting, are you taking into account how it affects men and women in the different communities in different aspects? How do we get women to be involved, to be at the table? And we often sometimes push a lot for, I think one of the gaps that has come about over the last few years, we push a lot for women's participation and women's representation at the highest tables. And I think it has been spoken about here. Women's sit at the table, but having a woman sitting at that table does not guarantee that anything will come of it. Not so much because she can't, but because of the environment that she finds herself in. She might be at that table with 20 men, or she might be at that table with 2 men, but again, it goes back to the social, cultural context. We've been trying to, we are currently now trying to work on a program in Lesotho. And one of the things, Lesotho, the paradox of Lesotho is it has one of the highest numbers of women represented, whether it's in the security sector, in government, they are in leadership, they are everywhere. In terms of, and women in Lesotho actually finish school, stay in school longer than the boys, because then the boys are going to the highlands, to the mountains to head cattle. But funny enough, the paradox now is when these women, we spoke to one of the officials in the Ministry of Gender, and she said, no, when I'm here and someone in the security sector, when I'm at work, the men salute me. I'm in charge and they understand that my job, I'm the person in charge. But when I get home, I'm a woman, I'm a wife. And Lesotho has extreme levels of violence, like 86%, 8 out of 10 women in Lesotho have experienced some violence. And these are very empowered women. So you get that, the very norms, the cultural context, the social, how it tips everything. And this is why we keep getting, the law is there, the beautiful law is there. The policeman knows exactly what he needs to do. And yet when a woman comes into the court, his first question is, what were you wearing? What did you say to him? That's the first thing that comes to his head. Not so much, but he did something wrong, he needs to be arrested. No, no, no. His question is, what did you do? Because in his head, women are the ones who are always wrong. So that trying to, this is the one thing we are struggling with and working with, and we're bringing in the traditional leaders and everybody. How do we use the culture to turn it around to respect? Because we do understand, years ago, long time ago, ancient times, women were respected. I'm sure maybe it wasn't recorded, but I don't think there is high levels of GBV that we have. This respect was there. How do we get that respect back into communities? So apart from us working on in terms of getting policies in place, getting the different countries to actually have national plans that they work with that commit different levels of government that are costed and funded, because there's no point in having a beautiful strategy with no funding. I think for South Africa, you all know the National Strategic Plan, which has been great. The GBV Council, it's been 2 years. We are waiting for that. At the presidential summit 2-3 weeks ago, women kept asking that question, when is the GBV Council coming into place? Because for the last 2 years, different civil society organizations have been working on this on a voluntary basis. So there's no coordination from government, and that GBV Council needs to be in place. It's been gazetted, it's sitting somewhere, I think in cabinet or something. Nobody knows where the council is. And without that, you can't now go to Treasury and start pushing, where's the money? I think one of the questions that came around during the summit was, Mr. President, you committed 1.4 billion rand to GBV. Where is that money? The person from the Treasury couldn't answer the question. They had no figures. And I remember one of the civil society organizations was so upset that, you cannot, this is totally disrespectful. You cannot come to a platform like this on accountability and you don't have figures. You can't tell us anything and yet you are here. So it's this kind of things that we grapple with and we try and understand. How do we work around this? How do you get, is it an issue of SOPs? Do we need to have standard operating procedures to then force the duty bearer to do, whether they believe it or not, whether it's within their norms or culture, what they're forced to do it because their job demands that they treat a woman who comes to report a case in a certain way. If she comes to report, she needs to be in a private space. You need to listen to her. You can't ridicule her because your job requires that. Not so much that you believe it. Maybe that's a way to go around it in terms of strengthening institutions to then actually respond to GBV. I think in a roundabout way, hopefully I answered the question.
Yes,
Thank you. For our last section, we're going to return to a similar lens through what we asked you to consider in the beginning, which is activism, what brought you in the space. Now we're going to go deeper into the topic of activism and consider different points and ways forward. We've diagnosed the problem very well. I think all the speakers really spoke brilliantly, not just in South African context, but different contexts within South Africa and the global South in general. So we are going to now look at activism.
I think just from the discussions that we've had, we first of all identified that gender-based violence is an intersectional problem, and intersectional problems need intersectional solutions. So we've had amazing points being brought up on legislature and its shortcomings and its versatility. But I also think that this is the point in which the role of activism becomes an important one, because not everybody is a lawyer or a police officer, but everybody has the capability to stand against injustices in their front line. And so directing this question at Dr. Kathleen, with gender-based violence being a conversation that's being highly promoted by women, how are we bringing men into the conversation and encouraging them to speak up? Especially in instances, it's been briefly brought up that men also have instances where they're also victims of gender-based violence, but how do we encourage them to join the platform in a society where the patriarchies and patriarchal values are still rampant, still prominent, still directing our society in very prominent ways?
Thank you for the question, Barbara. But I'll look at it in two ways. In the first way, I'll say, using activism, I would drag the men screaming and kicking into the conversation. Activism is usually single-minded, and it's very clear about the single issue it wants to achieve. So you cannot be too accommodating when you're being activist. And so when I first thought about what you're asking, I said, well, we must never lose sight of the fact that we are African. We have a context that is specific to us. And so if we're trying to draw men in, not so much to agree with what we're saying, but to see the value of it, then we have to have a strategy. And I think Maureen and Professor and Meline have been able to show that there is structure, there is process, there is system. But the harmony across the board is not necessarily there. So how do we, in that convoluted sense, how do you then bring somebody in? And so the deeper question we're asking is not how do we bring men in, but what do we bring them in to do? That's raising the bar a little bit more. So when you're bringing them in, they're doing something and not just spectating and sometimes becoming a nuisance on the side. So with that in mind, what one would do, or what activists have been able to do when they've added men into the conversation or brought men into the conversation or invited them into the conversation, is help them see a partnership. So you must begin from a platform of partnership. What is it that we can achieve together? Because even though we're very good at homogenizing scenarios, it is not homogeneous. There are some success stories that have worked. And it is interesting, human nature, on looking at success stories, tries to pattern along those success stories. So in Kenya, and I'll just bring in a paradox first. In Kenya, we have the 2/3 gender rule, where we say that in any appointment, there must be, the 2/3 must not be of one gender, which means women come in as a third, if they're 2/3 of men. But it is not uncommon to see pictures, even of presidential appointments, where it's all men. and your eyes just open and you wonder what is going on here. Or if they have to add women, they'll add one woman. Now, the converse of that is actually creating scenarios where you have more women and add that one man, because he becomes then the ambassador of saying, well, actually things do work. Actually we are sticking to the rules and regulations. It is not as if I am joining a fray, I'm joining an organized entity here. So bringing men in as partners into the conversation, and it can be at different levels. It can be at the community level, and I've seen this work in the low-income areas and informal sectors where I have done some work. I've noticed that there are women's groups, but in that women's group, there are men. And that was very amusing at the first time I came across that. And the women said that the men had come to ask to be included in those groups because the groups were working. And so men wanted to be a part of that group. And the women were not aggressive about it in saying, no, you stay away because you're different. They said, okay, come in, but we're not giving you any official positions. You cannot hold office. You come in as another actor in the group. And that worked. So in whatever agenda we are having for women and by women, including men as partners, I think does more in terms of leveraging whatever plans we have, because these plans are not in the sky. The plans have to be domiciled in society, and society really has both groups. And I have seen this work. If you look at the history of women in development, what was happening, the gospel in the 70s and the change in the 80s that sought to include men, and in the 90s where men were harmonizing the narrative, you got better, especially because in the South we talk about development. You got better development outcomes when men were included in what women were doing versus leaving them out. So that became, the GAD approach, and that provided better outcomes. So bringing in men as partners and then showing them that they are beneficiaries, and that could be a cultural approach where when this works, it works for everybody. And I think the UN Women had a mantra at one time that said, when you educate a woman, you educate society. So it's benefiting all of us. You eat better food, you have better conversation, you enjoy more laughter, and your children are healthier. Those kind of scenarios. So building synergies around collaboration, partnerships, and where there'll be benefits for all, not just for themselves, I think is one way of bringing men into the activist activism space. I also know for a fact that in Kenya, where you've got CBOs and NGOs, it is interesting. Whenever they're going out for a march or public awareness, usually they're led by men, and that sometimes is. You can see when they're meeting communities, there's a shift. They're wondering, okay, this is a women's organization. Why is a man talking for women? And of course, the men just take the introductory part and then let the women continue. But the point is to show that a collaborative effort does succeed. And in advancing the rights of women, we're not necessarily excluding men. Neither are we saying men need to be to lose their power. It is really sharing power. And so you speak to the equality that you're driving towards. So I would say a bottom-up approach in activism, where you ask both men and women, what do you want to see? What should the end look like? And that way you can design towards that end versus, hoping that somewhere along the line the men will jump in and fit in. What activism also does is it provides an opportunity for demystification, because then you get to see what it is. So when you have public awareness fora, for example, and invite everyone, this woman thing becomes demystified. It's no longer the other thing. It is the thing. And with the thing, we can become a part of it. So I have found that also very useful when public awareness campaigns are done to help people know. I think one thing we always do forget in sub-Saharan Africa, especially when we have had more women getting educated, yes, but most of them are not. The level of ignorance would be amazing. In a way, you still hear a woman saying, in terms of remedy, I gave my children this kind of diet, but I go to sell what I plant. So the children are eating just starch throughout in terms of nutrition, and she's selling what is more nutritious, and she doesn't know because nobody told her. So I think the idea is to educate women and then harmonize it all by bringing in a partnership, showing beneficiary and collaboration. So using those words both in public and in private, I think will achieve a lot. And again, jumping at media, assuming, of course, some of the conversations we make have got a lot of middle-class bias, but in, for example, rural areas where sometimes the radio is still the medium of communication with the outside world, using radio programming that allows for programs on women's issues, but with men's, from a men's perspective, adding them to the conversation can help a lot. I know, for example, the Family Planning International achieved a lot by including men in women's fertility issues. And so we can use the same template. We don't have to reinvent the wheel and use the same direction. And I'm not saying this because activism has not done it. Activism has actually done it. It just needs to be done without feeling that it is different or it is strange. That needs to be the way forward. Because by including men, you get to not just providing a view of women as human beings, but also you bring in the capabilities approach of the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, that women have agency, that when you consult, you achieve better. Women are not just, and somebody had, one of my co-panelists had said, women are not just objects or to stand there and look good, or you have bought them, and therefore all you need is, they're an investment and they need to be giving back, plowing and having more children, and children of a certain type, and not the ones that are not performing well in school. Those don't belong to you. Those kind of biases that seep right through, where you take no blame, I think comes from an unparticipatory approach. And so sensitizing men towards SIDO, many men will not know what SIDO is, but through activism, we will tell them there's actually a clause here that allows for this to be happening. And when it happens, you will not die, because somehow they fear, with all due respect to the gentleman in the room, they fear to die earlier or sooner than women, even though they do. We just don't tell them very loudly that they'll not die by giving a little and gaining much. So partnered advocacy, mobilizing, and like I said, making men begin to provide some of the solutions to women's issues. I think using an activist lens will achieve a lot more. And so in my view, I think it's already happening, but it needs to happen more. And so that they don't think of women are plotting somewhere in a corner to do something. They're not plotting. You're part of it. You knew what they wanted to do, and they did roll it out. So the few barriers we see, we should be able to overcome those. I know in our country, in Kenya, the judiciary has been very active about including women, but those women will also tell you they have had to, jump through quite a number of hoops. When I was listening to Jeppy saying she's inspired, she wants to get there. The warning we tend to fire is that, Jeppy, when you get there and you join the men's club, then it all goes to naught, because you want to identify more with the club than with what the mandate that you have. So as women, I think the onus is on us to continue talking loudly and expanding the space, which includes the men, because you get better outcomes in the long run, socially speaking. And now that we're all about environment, the environment is a lot more conducive, even in terms of rolling out the plans and strategies that we would want to do, that would want to be more robust and more articulate for the future, especially in the global South.
Thank you, Dr. Nangwe. It is very important to continue this conversation as women and make it a collective effort to involve even the men in the society. But if we're to narrow it down to our institutions of learning, considering we are a group of young African feminists, and we're lucky to have two individuals who interact with students on a daily, that is Professor Domingo and Dr. Kathleen yourself. We would love to know how these policies are being implemented to create awareness around GBV among students, and also to promote the whole initiative and the whole activism within our institutions of learning. Perhaps we could hear from Professor Domingo on the same.
Thank you for that. So I think every institution of higher learning now has policies and procedures around this. But one of the things that we've called for is the actual publication of these so that students can see it, that it's understood by them and it's enforced. We've called for the continuing monitoring and evaluation of those policies as well by these institutions. But most importantly, gender equity officers on campuses has been something that I've promoted. So just to let you know, before joining UJ, I was at Wits University for almost 20 years, and they established what was called the Sexual Harassment Advisory Committee to always have oversight over the cases that came forward. As well. So I want to say something that I did this year. So this year when I thought about, I always do something with my students, and this year I did something with my final year students. And I said I didn't actually just want to tell them about the legislation. I wanted to do something practical. So what we did is we did a self-defense class. I invited all the female students. I got someone in, and we did a self-defense class. I didn't have anyone talking. I didn't say we're going to have this speaker and that speaker. I wanted them to take something physically away, and they enjoyed it. The students absolutely enjoyed it. So it was, for me, that was something slightly different. And I think we need to have compulsory self-defense classes in first year orientation. And then continue with that, because self-defense is also, it needs to be, it gets entrenched in it's muscle memory. So we need to have that for students, and that is one of the things we do. We also have a feminist drive, a feminine, I want to say, drive where we collect feminine products. And so we added to that, and we said to staff members and any students, if you have old bags, or if you want to donate a bag, and in that bag, we would put a sanitary pad, we would put anything that you would need should you go to a police station and report a matter. And we delivered those bags and we packed them with information. We put certain products in there, and we delivered it to some of the police stations around the university area. So that was something practical which students could do, because you don't often think what a woman actually needs when she goes to that police station to make a report, or even if it is a situation of domestic violence. So those were the small active kind of things we've done. We've also had the Red Lipstick Day in April. There is the NGO Read Her Red the Lips. So for a month, we all wore red lipstick, and we spoke out very strongly against gender-based violence, particularly towards leadership. If you are in those leadership positions as well, it's important. Some universities have walls where you actually write your stories in, or you put something down in support of the other female students. What I did also with some of my students in terms of activism, and I just can't remember the book now, but it's Breaking the Silence. It's written by a male about breaking the silence with the University Orientation Week, where a lot of females actually get drunk because they drink the cocktail drinks, which you think you're not drinking a lot. It's the blue ones or the yellow ones. It's the fancy ones with the umbrella in. They have high levels of alcohol content in there. And what has happened is that a lot of females get raped during that orientation week, and they don't come forward because they blame themselves. So it's like, I drank the alcohol, I was drunk. It's the first time I come to university. What is my mother going to say if she finds out? You must remember, a lot of the students that I deal with are first generation university students. To go back home and to say that you've been raped or you're pregnant is something that they cannot do. It brings shame on themselves and the entire communities. So what we've also said to students is, it's not your fault. So trying to educate, particularly during that first year orientation. What I've also done, and what we're doing within our university, is also having an app. So it's a Mobi app. It is an app to monitor activities on the campus. If you are not in a safe place, you can call protection services. I've also partnered with a company that does have an app which we load onto the students. It comes on your phone, and it's not really an app which is going to say, this is your gender-based violence app. It is disguised as a different app on the phone. So if you are in trouble, you can call your circle of friends, or you can immediately call the police. Now, part of the app, and that what is happening with these apps, is predictive analytics, where you are trying to predict when and where gender-based violence is taking place. And in the UK, there was an interesting study that found that after a soccer match, since it's the World Cup now, after soccer matches, when the losing team loses, there's a high incidence of gender-based violence. And that's an interesting thing, particularly as we are in the season of the World Cup happening. So it would be interesting. So those are the kinds of analytics at a university space. What I'm trying to understand is it only when we have orientation week that we see a spike in gender-based violence or not? We also have at universities what is called the sugar daddies, or the ministers of finance, as they call them. These are men that come onto campuses during orientation week. They look out for the pretty young girls and they support them financially. And with that comes abuse as well. And so we're looking not only at physical abuse, but psychological abuse and controlling behavior of a young woman. And these men park outside, they have fancy cars, they provide them with money, cell phones, they do their hair, nails, all of those. So there's a trend in that as well. So we're educating women around that. So there's a number of initiatives happening at campuses, but I think it is, what I did was a town hall meetings as well. So I have general town hall meetings. And what was interesting about the town hall meeting this year was that the male students were saying, we want to participate. You tend to focus only on the females, Prof. Domingo. Where are the workshops for men? Where are the masculinity workshops for men? We want to be part of that. And these were my first year students. And I thought, how amazing that we now have this wonderful generation of young men who are standing up and saying, enough is enough as well, because we also don't want to be labeled constantly as men who violate women. So for me, this was absolutely fantastic. It's the first time that I've heard the male students saying, we want something specific for us, but it was around their own masculinity. Which was heartwarming for me. But we continue with initiatives. I try to do different things. I think all universities are doing different things. But what I want to say, what irritates me the most is that it becomes a tick boxing exercise. It's like the end of the year, there's these annual reports. What have you done in terms of gender-based violence? How many cases did we have? How many students dropped out? And it becomes a tick box. What I've asked our university to do is, don't tell me how many perpetrators there has been in universities. So I want to know how many students there were and how many students have remained in the system after the violence has occurred. Because I said there was a high dropout rate. So yes, we expel the student, right? Because disciplinary hearings takes place. But how many of those victims remain in the system with us and that we support them, because they also tend to drop out. So for me, that's important. And then obviously as a law faculty, we have law clinics. We have one in Soweto, we have one in Doornfontein, and we have one in Auckland Park in Johannesburg. So we tend to reach out to different communities. And part of the work that our students do is community engagement, educating women. We also have cases, so our students engage with women coming to those clinics. So that's a little bit of the access to justice. So where women, you said where women couldn't afford to go, that is part of the access to justice for women. And we make sure that our students engage with students, with clients, so they can see face to face what the lived reality of women's lives are. So those are just a few of the things that we've done, but I'll end up there. And I mean, I think there's much, much more that we can continuously do. Thanks.
Thank you. I think because we're pressed for time, we shall swiftly move on to the next session.
Okay, directed at Melina. I'm going to restructure it, a question from the participants. A participant uses Rwanda as an example, where they have the highest representation of women in parliament in the world. While you were speaking, you brought up quite passionately how important representation can be throughout the structure of these institutions. What do you think the pros and cons of having a representational requirement in these structures, like something like what Kenya implemented? What are the pros and cons for the context of South Africa? I think you're still muted.
I'm so excited about the question, but I'm going to be very quick because of time, because I've always had an issue with this thing. I mean, I love Rwanda, by the way. I really hope that Paul Kagame doesn't hear me saying this, but I'm actually not very trustworthy. I don't trust his cabinet. I don't trust the fact that there is such a high representation of women there. I don't even trust Africa's government bragging about their 50% in parliament and the executive, but the numbers within parliament and within the executive is not translating to change. Now, you see, let us be clear, and I think the lady Moline from UN mentioned that. The fact that there's women in parliament and in the executive does not mean that there will be changes for women. You must understand these people are elected from a political party which is predominantly patriarchal, okay? For them to even have gone up to that level or to have been selected is an honor. So they will not step out of the political party line, which is a problem. And that is why we had to protest for years and years and years and years to get the NSP of gender-based violence and femicide on the table. Because really, if we had representation within parliament, women who are really genuinely committed towards gender transformation, gender justice, gender equality, and all these gendering things, we would not have been, it was not necessary for us to have protest for it at all. Okay? They would have brought it because it was that serious. They would have pushed for the agenda from the inside. And that's how I understand government to work. Okay, so what we need are really progressive women. You know what my dream is for independent feminist women to get into political power. That's my dream. That's my dream. I wish that there could be more feminist political organizations and parties that will contest elections on the African continent and just send these patriarchal political parties, you know, to wherever they need to go. We're 50% of the population. You know, there's solid people like yourself, young ladies like yourself, Hope, Barbara, and even you, Siobhan, you can also serve there as a feminist political leader because you're a feminist. You believe in equality. But you see, these women that we are currently electing are not, we must not be fooled by that. I've always had an issue and I was always excluded and abused because of my views on that. Because how can you be a gender equality activist if you say that woman, no, I'm saying that this woman that you've elected is a patriarchal character. I don't trust her, okay? And so we need to elect solid, good people, women in particular, that wants to drive the agenda for women's rights. That's the kind of woman, the character and caliber and competent woman that we would want to see in parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. That definitely answers the question. I'm going to hand over to our leader, one of the founders of 16 Days, Vana.
Thank you, everyone. I think that a lot of the questions that were in the chat that we had made time for have actually been very comprehensively answered by the speakers during the questions that we'd asked them. And I think that the ones that have been answered now also, as Melina has just said, very inspiring, and we're very, very glad to have Siobhan on our in our group as well, just because apart from encouraging men to be a part of the conversation, having them already here is an even stronger way of bringing people in, you know, like essentially representation. If there are more male feminists, there's a higher chance that we will attract more men into the feminism space. So just reaching the end of our webinar, I think we would like to have some parting shots from our panelists. I think Hope could take over from there.
Thank you. I believe it's been such an intense session so far. I've loved each and every panelist's contribution to the conversation. I've actually been taking notes. I hope to get a story from this. As I said, I am a student journalist, and I know that we will keep pushing the narrative, but it will be even better if we all just ended it with a bang as we started it. And perhaps we could start with Melina with your parting shots, and we can hand it over to our other panelists.
Molina or me?
Melina.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I didn't get to answer that question. I really was hoping that I could answer that question, and that was on the issue of what do I think is the main reason for gender inequality, and how can feminism address vulnerabilities? Now, listen, we don't even have to delve into reasons. There's only one reason, only one. The key public enemy is patriarchy. Okay, that is the enemy. That is the reason why women are seen as inferior. That is the reason why men in society, and some women have these toxic social, cultural, religious ideas about gender roles and values and stereotyping and discrimination. It's because of patriarchy, okay? Let's not confuse the issue with bringing in apartheid and colonization. These are drivers. These are drivers towards patriarchy, but patriarchy existed for eons and eons and eons. It's always been there. If we want to tackle gender-based violence, besides law, besides adding the law and going to the courts and all this stuff, we need to do prevention. Prevention through education. And us as feminists, we need to build and strengthen feminist movements. We need to entrench our feminist ideologies. We need to continue to identify and to highlight and to expose and challenge these systems and structures and people that continue to create injustice and oppression for women. That is what we need to continue doing. So while we're doing that, we are really challenging the patriarchal system. And if we can get rid of that, we would have won. We would have won.
Thank you. Guess the whole key is getting rid of the patriarchy. And how about you, Professor Domingo? What would be your parting shot?
So quickly, I do want to say that I'm also a commissioner of the South African Law Reform Commission. One of the projects that I am leading is a discussion paper that will come out soon, looking at domestic violence in and of itself as a crime. It's not a crime. Remember, we had the Domestic Violence Act, which is civilly done. You get a protection order. The discussion paper looks specifically at looking at domestic violence in of itself as a crime, as well as strangulation. So I just want to put that at the table, because I will send it to everybody as soon as we've done with it and the issue paper comes out. But I've just got one parting word. I just want to say, Aluta Kantunia, the struggle continues. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Prof. And we do have a question that just popped up in the chat section, and that is, how can we relate the GBV issues and the implementations of SDGs in our different societies? I believe as Moline is giving her parting shot, she could answer this question perfectly.
Thanks, Hope. I think in terms of, I will do the SDGs first. I think if we look at the SDGs, because oftentimes when you're looking at gender-based violence, it's issues around power, it's issues around disempowerment, it's issues around women not being strong enough, not being financially dependent, so they're dependent on somebody else. Women not having access to health or not having the means, so they need somebody else. Women having to walk long distances to fetch water, which makes them vulnerable. So when you look at the SDGs, all the 17 issues around ending poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, these are the things, if they are not there, they predispose women to GBV. Because if she doesn't have food, she's hungry, she's more likely going to then have transactional sex so that she can feed her family. In transactional sex, she's then left vulnerable. If she doesn't have clean water and she's moving long distances to fetch water, she's predisposed to HIV, to gender-based violence and HIV, and then which comes with HIV. If she doesn't have the education, she's not educated. I think one of the stats we have is that the least educated women are the ones that face the highest levels of GBV, because they don't have access to the information. They can't write, they can't even read in terms of where the information comes from. So all the SDGs kind of, in a sense, address the structural issues that actually perpetuate GBV. When those things, a lot of those things are addressed, women are less predisposed, in a sense. SDG 5, which is the one that we champion, the gender equality, the biggest of them all, having that, in which ties then into the patriarchy that Melin spoke about. Within SDG 5, you're looking at all the things that you want the different genders, the different people, men to see women as equal, have that issue, have those conversations around gender equality. How do you respect a woman? How does a man look at a woman? How do you get a man to look at a woman and not look at her as property, as a sex object, and as someone worthy to be a leader? How do you get men to respect women in leadership, so that because she's there as a leader, she's there because she has earned it, she has worked for it, not because she's a quota, that it's a quota system in parliament or something, but she has actually earned. She has been educated, she has studied to be there. A female professor and a male professor have worked just as hard to be at that level. So there's no reason for them to be treated differently because she's a female professor and he's a male professor. They cannot be treated differently because they've equally worked as hard to be there. So it's issues around that. And then I think in terms of my parting shot, one of the things probably that I would say we need to look at is to catch them young. Start with boys from a very early age. As young little men, there was something I was looking at. One of the things I think African Americans called there, and there's a woman on Twitter was mentioning this, that as African American women, for some reason, language, very important. They call boys little men. My little man is doing this. And there's a huge connotation to calling a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old boy a little man, because man implies something else, implies strength. So already at 5, he's looking at it, I'm a man, I'm this. And there was this Twitter thing with this little boy, 5 was, I'm a man, I don't do that. 5-year-old boy, I'm a man, I don't, because he's already internalizing that I'm a man. So it's the language and the things that we say and that we do. And I think as mothers, as grandmothers, as aunts, we have this power. How do we shape these young men? Just as a mother, I wouldn't want my daughter to be violated or to be abused. At the same time, I wouldn't want my son to be abusing somebody else's child. So I should be teaching my son that, beating a woman or not respecting women is wrong. It shouldn't be okay only when it's somebody else's child. And when it's my child, my daughter, then all of a sudden it's not okay. So we should be inculcating those values in our young boys, in our sons from a very tender age, so that they grow up knowing that washing dishes, there's nothing wrong with me washing dishes. As mundane as that sounds, there's nothing wrong with me washing dishes. There's nothing wrong with me helping my mom cleaning the house. There's nothing wrong with me cooking. It doesn't mean I'm less of a man. I'm just helping and I'm supporting my mom because maybe she's sick, or I'm supporting my sister. Changing those narratives in the culture and the norms that we have, it has taken years to be here. And I think it will take us years again to change that narrative. And to start with the younger ones, because you can't teach an old dog new tricks. These 50, 40, 30-year-old men, you can't go to them and start telling them something else, something they've learned throughout their entire life. But at least with the young ones, we can start changing that narrative, that they start looking at themselves different. They start looking at their sisters as women is different, as other people, another person who is just worthy of respect, another person who is worthy of the same, who should earn the same that I earn. How a woman CEO and a male CEO earn different amounts is beyond comprehension. They do exist. If anything, the female CEO does even more work than the male one, but she earns less than him. And these are the things that need to be changed. And I think one of the ways we can change is to start training the young boys so that they grow up knowing different values from the ones that we grew up having. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Truly, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And that's just emphasizes the fact that we need to start this while we are young. And that is exactly what we are doing here. And Dr. Anangwe can close the session for us by giving us her parting shot. What would you like us to go home with?
Thank you for the opportunity, Hope, and I want to echo the words of Professor Marlene and Moline, that indeed we're in this together, and we must be vibrant about it, we must be deliberate about it. My parting shot would be that more and more activism, you can't have enough of that. Looking at activism as value addition on that whole supply chain of the gender discourse, I think will get us further. You know, what is it doing? What is the impact? Always evaluating ourselves. I think that's going to be good. GBV post-COVID has allowed us to look at the scope critically. And I think that's the way to proceed, because we are asking questions now, not just the ones in the chat, but even with what we're doing, you know, as professor rolls out her wall at the university where students will write, you can see anger. What do you do with that anger? I know at the University of Nairobi, our problem has been when you find the student who is at fault, the male student in this case at fault, what do you do with them? Do you expel them? And so we never get to hear whether they were actually expelled. When you have also gender-based violence that comes from power structures, from the professor to the female student, and now from female professors to male students. How does that get calibrated along, and how is it concluded? Those are real issues that we go beyond orientation, and that is something we need to be looking at. So for me, a critical approach going forward is going to answer most questions now, seeing as where we are post-Beijing, where you've got more stakeholders now embedded in systems, women at leadership positions who we must expect something from. And I liked Marlene's view that the women we're selecting or electing or nominating sometimes they shouldn't be there. They're coming in as apologists of the patriarchal system. So how do we get the activists at the center? And perhaps that should shake things up a little bit and take them in the direction that we want them to go. So deliberate activism is the way to go. Maybe I should add deliberate critical activism is the way to go.
All right, thank you, Dr. And this is me passing it back to our leader.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you, everyone. I think we have finally reached the end of our webinar. When I say that we've scratched the surface in terms of this discussion, and it's just like a tree with new branches, new questions that we need to address. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that there's so many things that we've opened the floor for discussion now to delve into. We could go on for hours. We had a lot of questions prepared that we had to skip just because, there was so much to be said. And I think that's the wonderful thing about having such expert panelists with us, is that there are things that we do not, think about that they've brought to the table, because this is something they've been working with and working on for a long time. And so there's experiences and there's voices that are never amplified. And this is the opportunity that we have to hear about them and bring light to a lot of issues. And I think just the whole discussion around intersectionality, that was what was brought to the front line. That is what kind of the determining factor for what makes a member of society a vulnerable member in society, and how are we being accountable in our ways of addressing those issues, and not just presenting kind of solutions on paper, but actually being accountable for what we're doing. And there's so much I could say. We had Prof. Isike last year, who really emphasized the point as well that when you bring women into parliament as a quota system, you will not see the results that you're looking for. It's about choosing, and it's not even an issue of having a shortage of qualified women in our society, but it's about looking beyond the politics and the nepotism and actually having intentions for redressing the disparities in our country, and using that as a foundation for the journey towards true gender equity. And not equality, but equity, because we have vulnerable groups that we are focusing on. So I think I'd like to just thank our expert panelists, Dr. Kathleen Anangwe, Marlene Rousseau, Marlene Maruma, and Prof. Wasal Domingo, for giving up their time and their invaluable expertise to our space. We don't take a moment of your time for granted. I would also just love to thank every single member of the audience for taking time out of their weekend to join this important discussion. Thank you for all your contributions in the chat. We know there were quite a few experts in the chat as well, in the audience as well. So we thank you for being present and sharing your expertise and your contribution in that regard. And to everyone who joined, your presence is what makes this webinar possible and what encourages us to keep going. And if you just bear with me, I have to thank my amazing team. We have been planning this webinar for months. You guys are amazing. I couldn't have asked for a better team to work with. Also passionate, also invested, also organized. Yeah, I really appreciate every single moment and minute of hard work that you've put into this. And of course, our families and our friends who have supported us and encouraged us in the journey, making us not afraid, despite the patriarchal norms that we've identified, not afraid to speak out on these issues and to be kind of advocates and encourage our peers to kind of be involved in the same space. And so I think that we hope to see you all again soon. Please keep your eyes out for our newsletter. We usually put one together at the end of the webinar. And because you put your emails in when you're registering, we'll just send them out to everybody. And we will see you soon. And we encourage you to take all of these messages with you moving forward.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, also
Thank
for
you,
attending.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you.